Hi, everyone. Thank you for continuing to tune in to our Google Ads accessibility webinar. So far, we've heard from accessibility experts on why inclusive design is important, how you can incorporate it into your company's culture, and how you can get started. Now let's talk about how you can prioritize your accessibility efforts. Our next speaker, Huang, has experience working in many countries across Asia, Europe, and North America. She brings global digital solutions to her projects and specializes in user flow, product strategy, accessibility. For the past 7 years, Sue has served as a subject matter expert in developing human-centric enterprise applications so that all users can achieve their goals regardless of their abilities and limitations. She continues to drive the effort to ensure accessibility is properly included early in the product developmental lifecycle. Thank you for joining us today, Sue. Let's get started.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's presentation and for celebrating the NICE Global Accessibility Awareness Day with us. And we will share the presentation after the event so you don't have to worry about losing the content. Today, we're going to talk about prioritize accessibility efforts. The agenda will include a little bit about myself, my accessibility journey, and cost to remediate the accessibility issue. Bake inclusivity into design process, get started with accessibility, and prioritize accessibility effort. Also, in this section, we will cover some low-hanging fruit and tips for pros. About myself, my name is Huang, and I'm an interaction designer on the Crowdsourced by Google team. I'm passionate about inclusion-based innovation and technology, and I also love music. I can fly to another country for a concert and fly back. That's how much I love music. How I started my accessibility journey. In 2013, I spent 6 months designing and developing a mobile app. I put my heart and soul into this product. And when it got to our QA engineer, and she told us, your product is not accessible. And we are like, wait, what? What do you mean by a product is inaccessible? At that point, I have 6 years of industry experience, but it was the first time I got exposed to screen reader. The first step I took was reaching out to our visually impaired user group within the company and learn from them. I'd also attended several meetups and workshops to educate myself. Within a month, we were able to resolve majority of the accessibility issues and also filed bugs to encourage other teams to make their APIs and services more accessible. Why is this important? 1 billion people, roughly 50% of the world populations, live with the disability. As product designers, how we do our job really matters. Here's a graphic showing the timeline and the associated cost, how much it will cost to remediate accessibility issues. According to the research done by IBM, if we consider accessibility from the beginning of the product development lifecycle, there will be no extra cost. If we think about accessibility at the implementation or integration testing stage, the cost will be 5 times or 10 times higher because the engineers have to rewrite the code multiple times, and also the backlog hours will prevent us from being efficient. If we wait until the customer beta test, the cost will be 5 times higher because it is hard for salespeople to sell the products, and it is hard for them to demonstrate or explain to the users. If the accessibility implementation is delayed until post-product release, the cost will be 30 times higher due to the increased customer support cost and lost sales revenue. It also damages the brand trust. It doesn't just affect the customers with disabilities, but also their friends and families who use the services and product to communicate with them. The impact will look like a wheelchair ramp that's building in parallel with the staircase, and the slope and the length are exactly the same. As we all know, it is not going to work. And also, it is very difficult for our customers to trust your brand again. There are also some civil rights and guidelines we have to consider. For example, it is standard and common for us to comply with ADA Title II and Title III. If your customer involved government agency, then you need to look into Section 504, 508, and ACA. If you also have videos within your product, then you have to familiar yourself with CVAA. There are also state laws and other legal theories. If you have customers global from other countries, then you have to think about the CRPD and international laws. Overall, when there's a lawsuit involved, the court usually use WCAG. WCAG stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, AA standard. So all of these is very good for us to educate ourselves beforehand. However, all the rules need an ethical implementation. We shouldn't just aim for meeting these compliance. How should we get started with accessibility? First of all, sign the accessibility leaders. So find your own advocate, partners, and executive sponsor. Understand the task, which means understand your team is starting from, so you can measure and the impact and outcomes in the end. Start developing a training program. It is very important for every single team member to have appropriate accessibility training. Also, get your leadership buy-in. Leadership support is the key to help teams to prioritize accessibility work and make it part of the culture. And get clear on the goals with leadership and teams. Define and document clear accessibility goals so leaders and teams are aligned and held each other accountable. How do we bake inclusivity into design process? Here's a graphic shows the regular and standard design process: learn, iterate, test, build, and iterate. Oh, ideate, I'm sorry. Okay, when conducting our research and during the learn and ideate stage, it is important for us to include personas with challenges and disabilities and understand how they interact assistive technologies and why. During the test process, it is important to include people with special needs. Don't just rely on automated testing because it will only cover 85%, because 85% of usability issues can only be found by people with special needs or with using assistive technology. For example, if you have a non-meaningful button label, the tool is not going to tell that. And during the build process, we should deliver very clear specification and annotations to our dev team so they don't have to guess the interaction or the annotations that we need for the product. How do we write the test cases? It's usually a best practice to align it with your critical user journey. The critical user journey means the combination of the critical goals and the journey of the task that the user have to take to achieve their goals. And it is the best way to recognize what's important to our user and the ways to focus on what really matters. And those should be our top priorities to get started with in terms of the accessibility considerations. And another important thing is that the test cases should always be created based on sessions rather than the end-to-end user journey flow. For example, it's not recommended to test from, if your product is an e-commerce site, it is not recommended to test from starting from the login to browsing the product to check out until the log out. So don't do it all at once. Break it down by verticals. Next, we are going to talk about the product inclusion considerations. There are 7 buckets: languages, socioeconomic status, race, religions, and standards, gender and orientation, environment and situation, physical and cognitive abilities. First, we are going to cover languages. The image was showing a girl using laptop and with different languages of hello in the back of her blackboard. So I'm going to show you some examples. When developing a product, we have to think about the translation, the language people are going to consume your content. For example, even if you're using French as your primary language, you have to consider it's a Canadian French versus French French. And also the punctuations. Sometimes in some forms, we will see people using comma to separate the keywords or use hashtag or something, right? But not all the language systems has these punctuations. So we have to think about that kind of special cases. And also the length of the translation. German and Hungarian tend to be way longer than English. So it is important for us to test those language and making sure we are not breaking the layout. And also the reading directions. For example, Hebrew and Arabic, their reading order is the opposite from English. So it is important to consider and make sure we have enough vertical space and rendering. Next, I'm going to cover some of the low-hanging fruit that you can do to get started. So for example, using the proper font size and color contrast. Low color contrast is actually the most common accessibility failure on any of the digital product. So in this case, we have to make sure we are not using dynamic type or fixed font size. Dynamic type means there's components, these sizes, the text will render based on the width and height of the component. For example, if you have the news headline that's way longer than other news headline, that particular news headline will be shrinked to fit in the same height and width of the article. So it is not recommended because when people have unique settings, you might override their settings. Also, the fixed font size, especially applied to products like in AR or VR areas. For example, if your users cannot see the text clearly, they might lean against forward to read the text. But if you have fixed font size, which means no matter how much they move, they cannot still see the text clearly. So we have to make sure we avoid that kind of situation. And also using concise image captions and bold attribute. When we write the captions, don't use redundant words like image of or photo of, because the screen reader will automatically describe that kind of component or situation to the user. We don't have to put the extra text there. And also avoid using all uppercase text because it will make reading harder for people with dyslexia. Another thing that we have to think about is using distinctable link styles. Use color and don't just use color as the only indicator, and make sure you have the clear focus and select state. Also, next is about allow default language to be determined programmatically. We are going to see some examples of why it is important. So the then attribute will help you define the language you're using. Assistive technologies use these to determine language selected for the user. For example, if you have a web page, it's a mixture of English and French. If you don't give the proper then attribute, what happened will If users default screen reader language is English, and it's going to read French using English pronunciation, and it's going to confuse the user, and they don't know what happened and why things are not understandable to learn. Another example that's shown on the screen is there are several multimodality translators. The screen was showing that a sign language, it is an AI generated signer for sign language. So if the signer or if this like a virtual assistant doesn't understand what language your content is using, then it's not going to choose appropriate translation for the user. They are also in this scenario, it explains why alt attribute or the image caption is important. When you do Google image search, there's also the small tagline below the image label. So which means this will impact your SEO performance, and also screen reader, they relied on this to give them the more context on the imageries. More low-hanging fruits we can do. Use the actual text and don't embed the text in the images. Also add page title so it's clear to the user where they are. And also allow keyboard navigations. Sometimes the people, for some reason, not just visually impaired user or people that have motor impairment, they will prefer to use keyboard. And a lot of time you will see your engineers probably only use keyboard without a mouse as well. So it is important to optimize for the keyboard navigations. And use proper heading sequence. In screen reader, there are a lot of settings that the user can choose. They can navigate the page by landmark, by paragraph, and also by headings, word by word. So imagine if you jump from H1 to H5, which means the user won't be able to clearly understand the structure of your page. So make sure your layout is in sequence and use semantic layout. And have the link purpose in context. A lot of time we see people use click here or the full length of the URLs. The problem will be, first of all, the user don't necessarily understand where is here. And another thing is that if the user are using screen reader, then they have to listen to https:// and the rest of your URL, which is not very user-friendly. And the next thing is provide the descriptive content. We're going to see it in the example coming up next. On this screen is showing the search result of the list of restaurants and descriptions. And the every single call to action is called make reservation. For visually impaired users, it would be very difficult for them to understand which reservation, which restaurant are they making at this point. So make sure when you're labeling this content, it is a good practice to say, make reservation at X restaurants. Don't just rely on what's showing on the screen. And this also echoes to the previous concept. Using automated testing tool is not going to catch this kind of usability challenges. Next, we are going to talk about some of the tips for pros. If you feel like you are resolved all the issues that stated previously in the low-hanging fruit area, then you should move to more advanced consideration, such as accommodate different levels of literacy. So when writing the copy or your content, always aim for 3rd to the 5th grade reading levels, because it's easier for people they don't speak English as their first language, or people they don't use they are not very familiar with the language for some reasons, right? And use simple and plain English, avoid jargon. So for example, using buy instead of purchase. And also use your sentence short and provide graphical cues for people who are not the first language, English is not their first language. And also help people with cognitive disabilities so they don't have to spend a lot of efforts reading word by word. they can have some visual cue to help them as well. And also provide progress indicator and other status changes with meaningful alternative text. A lot of time when the page reload or something, the screen reader users actually don't know what happens on the screen. Or if they click on the link, how do they know the new page has been presented to them? So having those kind of meaningful alternative text is going to improve your accessibility and usability a lot. Few more tips for pros in the language section. So set the reading and the navigation order in the meaningful sequence. The recommendation will be after you think about, or when you're trying to mimic how user interact with your product, imagine they're using screen readers. When there's a page transition, will the focus on the screen or the first sentence they're going to hear still make sense to them? So try to use familiar yourself with screen readers, then you will get the sense of how people have to navigate the product in the linear order. And stay away from some sensational phrases. So for example, sometimes people will have the headlines such as, drink red wine will kill the cancer. For this kind of statement will actually trigger some panic or anxiety for people with cognitive disabilities. And we should also avoid using ableist languages. Instead of writing see more on your within your content, try to use learn more, or try to avoid using crazy, insane, this kind of terminology that's very ambiguous with medical and the legal laws, those kind of descriptions. And allow user to bypass the content by block. You're going to see the example in the coming up slides, and also proper content grouping and flows. The first example is that it shows a homepage of the website, and next to the navigation, if users they are using keyboard, there's a hidden button called jump to main content. So which means screen reader users or like keyboard users, they don't have to tap through the repetitive utility navigations over and over again. They can directly escalate it to the main content area. So which so improve the efficiency for our users. And next, the proper content grouping is important because, for example, this screen shows a leaderboard. If we don't optimize the reading order or group the content, the screen reader user are going to hear, number 1, swipe, and the name of the user and gesture swipe. Number of contribution, gesture swipe, the name of the country. And they have to repeat this over and over again to listen to the entire leaderboard. So if we do the proper grouping, so the user can have one gesture swipe, rank of the user, name, number of contribution, and country all in one string, it will be very, very helpful for the user. They can skip ahead and they can decrease their interaction with the UI component. Next topic, we are going to talk about socioeconomic status. When we build our product, we have to think about what operating system we support and we optimize for. And we cannot assume that all the users have the most high-end devices or retina display. And also we have to consider their internet consumption and usage. Some of the low-hanging fruit should always compress your file sizes. If you have graphics, it is recommended to use SVG or WebP format. So it's not going to consume too much data from the user. Also, test your layout on the screen size that's smaller than 4 inches. And also test your app in the airplane mode to stimulate the lack of connectivities. In some countries, internet is very costly and the bandwidth is not as fast as the US. So we have to think about their use cases. Tips for pros. we have to make sure, if it's possible, make sure your app content is still available offline. Also provide a control and visibility to the device storage and usage. Sometimes a lot of people, they store a lot of their family photos and videos on their devices, so they wouldn't have much space to interact, to be used for your product. Also, you have to minimize the battery usage. A lot of the times you can turn your app on, use for a couple minutes, and then try to see the battery consumption for your product. There's also some built-in measurement you can see under settings as well. And avoid asking people to provide their email address or personal information before they have committed to your product. The reason why is that the research we did in some next billion user countries, and you will notice a lot of time people purchase their phone in the store, and the store staff actually set up their phone for them. And a lot of products actually require email address to initiate the product. If the store staff set it up for the user, majority of the time they never know their email addresses because somebody set it up for them. And another thing is that to allow your user to use your app or services for free initially, so you are not putting those kind of pressures on your users from the beginning. Next, we are going to cover race and religions. On this slide, there are two images. The first image is the Christmas decoration and very religious theme kind of setup. And we have to be aware and always be mindful that everybody is Christian. And when we are showing this kind of promotion on your homepage, then you have to be very mindful on how other people, other races will react to this kind of scenario. Another thing is that when you're selecting graphics or images for your product, make sure you have very diverse representation of all of your customers, not just focusing on one particular user group. Next is about standards and why standards is important. There are many different kind of users in the world, and majority of times that you have to think about what's familiar to them and don't force them to learn your product or how you set up your structure or content. For example, some countries, they're using military clock, not a regular time. So you have to make sure you honor the kind of representation. Some temperature measurement, Celsius versus Fahrenheit, and the imperial versus metric systems. So one example is that I remember a couple of years ago, one of the map product, they always show miles as the distance measurement, and how the product detected was based on user's IP address. And we got a comment from the user is that if I'm from UK and I flew to US to spend my vacation here, based on my IP address, I wouldn't all of a sudden understand how miles works because I've used kilometer all the time, right? So those are the things you have to think about, how to honor your user's operating system and their settings. Another thing is that you have to create what's the easiest way for you to have these reusable and robust, accessible design systems, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel over and over again. And your team can also share very cohesive experience and behavior, so user, they don't have to get lost or they don't have to confuse or learn the new patterns every time they use your product within your product ecosystem. Next, we are going to cover gender and orientation. So when doing the test, make sure you have very representative demographic in your study. Don't just screw towards to one particular groups, because you never know in what kind of scenario you might potentially create a content that might be offensive, or people feel like culturally not appropriate to their community. So make sure you have those exposure to very diverse conversation and user groups. Next, we're going to talk about environment and situation consideration. On this slide, there's a picture showing a father was making lunch with his daughter and with the voice active devices on the table. So when we talk about like designing for situation scenarios, you have to consider what if the user cannot use both hands to control the device? What if they have very spotty connectivity, or they're offline, or any kind of special device orientation they cannot change at the moment permanently or at the moment? So you have to think about the control size or the touch target size on your device in your product as well, and make sure there's also at least 48 pixel touch area for thumb. And also you have to think about any cases that people in that kind of inconvenience situation, what will be the easiest way to activate your product? For example, voice input instead of asking user to actually typing on the virtual keyboard. The last consideration is physical and cognitive abilities. In this area, we're going to talk about that you have to think about how your user and other assistive technology they might use to interact with your product. They are all different kind of accessibility, disability in the world. So you have to understand how people consume the content and what are their preferences. For example, when you design for your screen, don't just look at the regular standard font size. Try to zoom it into 200%, even 400%, because that's how the on-screen magnifier actually work. And you want to make sure once you have the font size that big, is that still easy for them to read the content or to get the most important content immediately, or is going to ask a user to pan back and forth in order to get a full picture of your product. So that's why the concise, the content, and the meaningful content is very important to the user, and the content grouping as well. And also consider users not just using the screen reader, but also the switch access, such as there are two huge buttons for the user. The white button means the white button on the left means the tab, similar to your keyboard tab key. And the orange button on the right means confirm and enter. So the user might be using these tab holders and to select the content they want and navigate with their wrist or any kind of technology they're using. And also consider that how can people interact with your product with voice commands. There are also the sip and puff joysticks that people who are in maybe in wheelchair or they have motor impairment. And there are also considerations that what if users are using the eye gaze tracking, mouse, or navigation on your product, how the experience is going to feel like. So make sure you optimize for those scenarios. We talk about a lot of like visually impaired use cases, and next we want to focus more on the cognitive disability area. So the tips for everybody is that always manage the expectations. So for example, for people with autism, it is very hard for them to have those to adjust to the sudden changes. So for example, if you give them like 5 options, it will be very challenges for them to select which one is the best for them. Usually 2 to 3, and with hint or recommendation is the good practice for them to help them to determine what product or services they need. And also allow the timing adjustment, because sometimes the people, like I said, they have panic or anxiety disorders. It is very hard for them to look at the timer to say how many minutes left they can purchase the tickets, or how many seats left, or how many rooms left until they can book the hotels they want. So having those kind of pressure on them actually will trigger a lot of after effect. Also, give user enough time to complete the action. What WCAG recommended is like at least 20 seconds for people to give their feedback to the product. And also identify additional accommodation the user needs. if you are going to host an event or even online webinars or any kind of situations, make sure one of the questions you're asking is that, do you need any special accommodations? And they will make people feel like you truly want to get close to the community. And let the user check their answers before they submit the final decision, because they give the user the sense of comfort, and also it's always a good practice and make sure people are not making any mistakes. And explain what happened after they complete the services. Don't let them wonder or feel like there's no feedback. Did I submit the form successfully? What am I going to get in the next email? Are you going to talk to me or not? So those are all the things that we can do better to actually help people. It's not just for people with like cognitive disabilities, but it's just in general the good user experience practice. And also ensure people they have controls. Especially, I mentioned, don't override any of the user's operating system settings. Motion and interruption, and consider authentication, these kind of things. A lot of times within the operating system accessibility settings, the user can actually make the adjustment there, and just make sure that you don't create another barrier or ignore those settings, and help user on the core task. Next, we're going to talk about when we build a product, design accessible product is not our end goal. We should optimize for building the accessible experience. After all these bullet points or considerations, you might feel overwhelmed because it's a lot for people who just started thinking about accessibility. But I want to encourage you that you are not alone. Building the inclusive digital product requires teamwork, and make sure you have the leader, you have the team, you have the advocate, that everybody put efforts together. When you just get started, you have to spend more time to find your advocate and sponsors, and also educate yourself, and keeping those kind of accessibility mindset. Like I said, what as a product designer, what you do really matters to your user. So don't take anything for granted. Every kind of small, simple efforts that you put in to improve your product accessibility, I'm pretty sure the users are going to appreciate it. Be patient. Don't expect changes to happen overnight. As we all know, it's hard to move the needle within a large organization, but just keep doing what you believe is good and true to your product, true to your customers, and make sure you're making the best decision for them. And thank you for coming to today's presentation. You're educating yourself, and this is a very successful first step. And I'm truly happy that you're here. I want to thank you for joining us. If you have any questions, feedback, here's a link for the survey. And like I said, you're going to have the presentation in the end of the event. And please reach out to us if you have any questions or comment. Thank you.